Winter 1944, the American Midwest. Dawn stretched slowly over frozen cornfields dusted white with frost. From the chimney of a wooden farmhouse, a thin ribbon of smoke climbed into the pale sky. Inside, a cast-iron skillet hissed as strips of bacon curled and crackled in their own fat. The smell drifted out into the cold morning air, a smell that did not belong to war but to home. In the barn nearby, a dozen German prisoners of war stirred from their cots. They were young. Farmers, students, mechanics taken from distant villages now turned to rubble. The sound of the sizzling pan reached them before the words of their American guard did. "Breakfast ready?" They hesitated, unsure. Back in Europe, their captors had been monsters from propaganda posters, the kind who starved prisoners, not fed them bacon. Moments later, they stood at a long wooden table beside the American farmhands, each holding a tin mug filled with steaming coffee. They ate slowly, silently, half grateful, half disbelieving. In that simple act over shared bacon and coffee, something far greater than breakfast began to unfold. By late 1943, the rhythm of American life had shifted entirely toward war. Factories thundered day and night, shipyards glowed under arc lights, and millions of young men were overseas. On the home front, that absence left a silent emergency. Who would harvest the food to feed both the soldiers and the Allies? Across the Midwest and Great Plains, tractors stood idle, fields ripened faster than hands could reap them, and farmers wrote pleading letters to state officials for help. Washington's answer was unconventional. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war could be put to work, provided they were treated humanely and paid a fair wage. By 1944, more than 425,000 Axis prisoners, most of them German, were shipped from frontline stockades to camps scattered across rural America. From Texas to Wisconsin, tents and barbed wire compounds rose beside fields of wheat and corn. Trucks arrived each morning to ferry small work details to local farms where they could replace missing sons and hired hands. The program began cautiously. American families had read the headlines. These were the same men whose army had bombed London, whose U-boats had torpedoed ships off the East Coast. But fear soon gave way to practicality. A farmer with 200 acres of beans ready to rot under the sun could not afford ideology. "Work's work," one Iowa grower told reporters. "And these fellas know how to swing a hoe." Inside the camps, the prisoners themselves were braced for cruelty. Nazi propaganda had painted America as decadent and vindictive, a land of chaos ruled by greed. Yet the first surprise came with breakfast. White bread, butter, eggs, and hot coffee. A meal few Germans had tasted in years. Each man received pay credits redeemable at the camp canteen. There were baseball fields, libraries, even classes in English and mathematics. The strictness was military, but the treatment was disarmingly civil. When winter thinned the harvests, smaller groups were assigned directly to private farms. The War Department called it the Farm Labor Program. For the men involved, it became something far deeper. Instead of guard towers, they found themselves sleeping in converted barns or tool sheds, sharing long work days beside American farmers, who treated them less like enemies and more like extra sons. Every morning began the same way. The kitchen door would open, the smell of frying bacon spilling out into the frosty air. The farmer's wife, apron dusted with flour, would nod toward the table. "Eat up." Some prisoners hesitated to sit. Others whispered "Danke." They learned that coffee here was not rationed as it was in Europe. It was poured endlessly, strong and black, into tin mugs that warmed their hands. What began as suspicion softened into quiet routine. Shared tools, shared meals, shared humanity. Reports from agricultural inspectors later described astonishing cooperation. Crop yields stabilized. Incidents of escape or violence were almost non-existent. By the end of 1944, German POWs had harvested 1/5 of America's sugar beets and helped keep wartime food prices under control. The experience was so ordinary that it became extraordinary. War fought with kindness instead of bullets. In diaries recovered decades later, many former prisoners wrote that their first real doubts about the regime they had served began not in interrogation rooms, but at those American breakfast tables. A plate of bacon, a cup of coffee, and the absence of hatred did what propaganda could not. It dismantled the myth of the inhuman enemy. The next phase of this story would unfold as spring returned and friendship took root in furrows, once turned by war. By early 1945, the enemy farmhand arrangement had become an invisible artery running through America's agricultural heartland. More than 30 states hosted branch camps linked to larger bases such as Camp Algona in Iowa or Camp Atterbury in Indiana. The federal government handled security. Local growers handled humanity. It was a quiet alliance between policy and decency. For the Americans, these men were no longer faceless foes in gray uniforms. They were workers who showed up before sunrise, who mended fences, who sang in German while stacking hay. At first, townspeople kept their distance, wary of fraternization laws that forbade direct friendship. Yet small gestures kept breaking through the wire. A farmer's daughter would leave an extra biscuit on a plate. A church group donated mittens one winter. An Iowa sheriff later recalled that the strictest rule broken most often was simply kindness. Life on the farms followed the rhythm of the seasons. Trucks collected the prisoners at dawn, their guards usually sitting up front smoking pipes while the Germans huddled on benches in back. They learned English words by pointing: shovel, bucket, barn, breakfast. In exchange, they taught farmers phrases of rough German, laughter bridging the gap better than translation ever could. Many of the POWs had grown up on small European farms. Their hands knew the feel of soil and rope. Within days, efficiency replaced suspicion. Meals became the center of this fragile trust. At noon, the prisoners would sit under shade trees while the farmer's wife brought out sandwiches, apples, and thermoses of coffee. The smell of pork grease and wood smoke seemed to cut through ideology. "You boys eat like us," one astonished private wrote home. They even say grace. To the prisoners, accustomed to rationed bread and ersatz coffee at home, each meal was a revelation, a glimpse of a land whose abundance appeared impossible under wartime conditions. Letters from camp censors captured the transformation. One German soldier wrote, "If our people knew how these Americans live, there would be no war." Another marveled at the simple luxury of choice: sugar in the coffee, butter on bread, the freedom to speak openly without fear of an informant's ear. Their captors' discipline was firm but never cruel. Guards were often farmers themselves, reservists or older men unfit for combat, who saw these prisoners less as threats and more as reflections of their own sons overseas. For the United States, the humane treatment was not merely altruism. It was deliberate policy, a demonstration of moral superiority designed to contrast Nazi brutality with democratic restraint. The War Department knew that word of mouth traveled faster than propaganda leaflets. Each well-fed prisoner became an unwitting ambassador for American ideals. By the time repatriation came, those impressions would ripple quietly across a defeated Germany. Still, not every interaction was idyllic. Some communities protested the presence of POWs, fearing escape or sabotage. A few isolated incidents, stolen bicycles, arguments over wages, made local headlines. Yet even those stories usually ended with reconciliation. When a guard shot and wounded a fleeing prisoner in Nebraska, the same community raised money for the man's medical care. Mercy had become habit. By the final months of the war, German officers visiting farm detachments reported an unmistakable shift in morale. The men no longer spoke of victory or revenge. They spoke of return, of coffee, of bacon, of a world where breakfast did not depend on ration coupons or air raid sirens. One lieutenant confessed to an American sergeant, "This is the first time I've seen what freedom looks like." When the harvest of 1945 ended, thousands of these prisoners would board trains home carrying Red Cross parcels and photographs of the families they had worked beside. Many tucked away small souvenirs, a coffee tin, a child's drawing, a folded American flag patch, reminders of mornings when enemies became neighbors. What began as a wartime labor program had quietly turned into a human experiment that proved decency could disarm faster than any weapon. The next chapter would explore those moments when suspicion gave way to genuine friendship, when German POWs and American farmers broke bread, and history softened one breakfast at a time. When historians later studied the POW farm programs, they found that its success rested on more than rules or rations. It thrived because of something intangible, a shared respect for work. In the German psyche, farming carried dignity, Bodenständigkeit, the belief that a man rooted in soil was closer to truth than one lost in ideology. For American farmers, labor was equally sacred. The sweat of one's brow defined virtue more than words or uniforms. When these two traditions met in the quiet furrows of the Midwest, Mutual understanding replaced propaganda. At sunrise, men who had once fought under opposing flags now worked in the same rhythm. One holding the plow line, another pitching hay, another checking the irrigation. They did not speak much, but the gestures were universal. The nod of acknowledgement, the shared drag of breath in winter air, the satisfaction of order restored to a field. Slowly, the invisible wall between captor and captive began to crumble. One striking angle of this story lies in the American moral experiment itself. Treating enemy soldiers with civility was not a spontaneous act of kindness. It was a deliberate assertion of democratic values. After the revelations of Nazi brutality in Europe, Washington wanted to show the opposite face, that strength and mercy could coexist. Propaganda films distributed by the Office of War Information highlighted clean camps, full kitchens, and humane guards. The message was clear. America conquered not just with firepower, but with fairness. Yet in practice, this morality was lived most authentically in small acts, not policy memos. On one Wisconsin farm, the prisoners helped rebuild a barn destroyed by a tornado. The farmer, moved by their effort, roasted an entire pig for them that Sunday. On another in Arkansas, the farmer's children taught the Germans to play baseball with broom handles and old gloves. In both places, the supposed boundaries of war melted in laughter, sweat, and the simple satisfaction of a job done well. The next angle is the psychological transformation of the prisoners. For men raised under rigid authority and fear of failure, the casual decency of American life was disorienting. Guards greeted them with "Good morning." Wives offered second helpings without asking permission. Payment arrived on time. These gestures may have seemed ordinary to Americans, but to many Germans they carried moral weight. Evidence of a system where dignity was assumed, not earned through obedience. One POW later recalled, "It was the first time I worked without fear." He and others wrote letters through Red Cross channels describing the incredible equality of life in captivity. Back home, such descriptions were censored or dismissed as lies. But the seed of doubt had been planted. What if America's abundance and compassion were not weakness, but a strength that Nazism could never replicate? Finally, the cultural collision over food became its own quiet theater of diplomacy. In Germany, bacon was a rare luxury and coffee a memory. On the American farm, these became symbols of normalcy, proof of a land so resourceful it could feed both its soldiers abroad and its prisoners at home. Breakfast was where hearts softened. A farmer pouring coffee into a POW's cup spoke more eloquently than any political speech. Those mornings formed the human core of the story, the warmth of kitchens, the smell of bacon, the murmured prayers before eating. They revealed a paradox of war, that humanity could survive even while nations clashed on an industrial scale. Each shared meal chipped away at the idea that victory required hate. As winter turned to spring, these quiet rituals of respect would shape both the productivity of the farms and the conscience of those who lived through them. There was another angle, economic pragmatism meeting moral awakening. For all its idealism, America's use of POW labor was first born out of necessity. The war had drafted away millions of farmhands, and in many counties, the German captives kept entire harvests from rotting. Yet over time, that practical arrangement turned into quiet introspection. Americans realized that even amid total war, they had chosen to feed their enemies rather than starve them. It was a statement of who they were as a people, confident enough in victory to show compassion without fear of appearing weak. For the prisoners, the revelation ran even deeper. Each morning's breakfast was a lesson in abundance. They saw food stacked high in pantries, bacon sizzling in cast-iron pans, milk bottles delivered at dawn. None of it fit the image painted by Nazi officers who had sworn that America was collapsing under corruption and crime. "They eat like kings," one captured corporal wrote home. "Even their poor have coffee." To him, the war no longer seemed like a clash between nations. It had become a contest of values. Then came the social dimension of contact. Some German POWs played harmonicas at barn dances. Others helped decorate Christmas trees or carve pumpkins in the fall. These scenes, photographed by local newspapers, scandalized a few officials but delighted many townsfolk. To them, the enemy had become human again. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Americans could look across a table and see not ideology but likeness. Another young man missing home, smiling over bacon and coffee, writing letters he might never send. A fourth angle was cultural transfer, the quiet diplomacy of daily life. The Germans absorbed American habits without realizing it. The handshake, the relaxed posture of conversation, the freedom to joke with authority. They learned songs from the radio, baseball terms, even how to brew stronger coffee. After repatriation, some would carry those customs back to a shattered Germany, helping to seed the culture that would later define the Western democratic half of the nation. Finally, there was the perspective of the American farmers themselves. They had lost sons to battlefields whose names they could barely pronounce. Yet each morning they fed young men who might have pointed rifles at those very sons months earlier. At first that contradiction felt unbearable. But as months passed, it became strangely redemptive. "We couldn't stop the killing over there," one Kansas farmer said later, "but we could stop the hate right here." His wife added that the sound of foreign voices at her breakfast table made her feel the world was smaller, and perhaps kinder, than newspapers claimed. By the time the war ended, these intertwined lives had created an invisible archive of decency. In 1946, when the prisoners were sent home, many left handwritten notes tucked under plates or pinned to barn doors. "Danke für die Freundschaft." Thank you for the friendship. Some mailed letters years later, enclosing photographs of their families, children named John or Mary in honor of the farmers who had once employed them. The bacon and coffee they once tasted as captives became symbols of something far more enduring, proof that generosity could rewrite the story of enmity. What began as a wartime labor program had evolved into a moral landmark. America's quiet assertion that the real strength of a free nation lies not just in its weapons, but in its willingness to share breakfast with a stranger. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe had ended. News of surrender echoed through every camp, but in the fields of Kansas, Iowa, and Texas, the work did not stop. The harvest was late, and the sky still rolled with thunder over wheat ripened to gold. The men in gray uniforms knew their freedom was close, yet they kept showing up at dawn, shovels in hand, as if the rhythm of American life had already claimed them. One morning, at a farm near Mason City, Iowa, something simple yet profound occurred. A storm had flattened part of the cornfield overnight. Before the farmer and his sons could reach it, the POWs were already out there, forming a line, lifting the stalks back upright. The farmer's wife, her apron soaked in rain, watched from the porch, unsure whether to call them in for breakfast. Finally, she carried a pot of steaming coffee and 2 platters of bacon to the field. Without a word, the prisoners gathered around, their hands still dirty from the soil. She poured each one a mug. No guards, no orders, just people standing in the rain drinking together. That moment captured the quiet turning point of the entire experiment. The war had begun as an exercise in total destruction. Yet here, amid muddy boots and laughter, was its opposite. Construction. What these Germans could not destroy in battle, they now helped rebuild in peace. And in the process, they discovered something none of them had expected: that America's true power was not its tanks or bombers, but its way of life. Letters from that season reveal the psychological climax of their transformation. One soldier wrote, "We were told Americans were decadent, living without purpose. Now I see their strength is that they share everything, even with those who fought them." Another confessed that he felt more respected as a prisoner in America than as a soldier in Hitler's army. Each cup of coffee, each handshake, each nod of trust chipped away at years of indoctrination. The guards noticed the change too. Discipline no longer came from fear, but from mutual responsibility. Camps recorded fewer escape attempts, fewer disciplinary issues. Farmers began asking for specific workers by name. When one POW fell ill, the family he worked for sent a quilt and homemade soup. Even military inspectors, bound by regulations, began to describe the atmosphere as closer to cooperation than captivity. Beyond the farms, the transformation rippled through entire towns. Churches hosted Sunday services open to POWs. Some local choirs even learned German hymns so that visitors could sing along. A Lutheran pastor in Nebraska wrote that it was the first time he saw enemy soldiers kneel beside American civilians at the same altar. The symbolism was immense. War had separated nations, but faith and food had reunited humanity. There was also an unexpected political dimension. As word of these encounters reached Washington, military officials realized they had created a form of soft diplomacy. Every German POW returning home carried not only memories but testimonies. When interviewed by Allied authorities, many expressed admiration for the fairness and freedom they had witnessed. This, in turn, became the moral foundation of America's post-war influence. The generosity that once seemed extravagant during wartime now functioned as propaganda for peace. Yet the emotional climax belonged to the farmers themselves. In one Kansas town, the news of Germany's surrender arrived on the same morning the POWs finished plowing the last field. The farmer's wife rang the church bell, and everyone, Americans and Germans, stood still. After a long silence, she brought out one final breakfast: bacon, eggs, and hot coffee for all. One of the prisoners lifted his mug and said in halting English, "To peace." The farmer nodded. "Peace," he replied, raising his own. Two men who had never met before the war now stood shoulder to shoulder, bound by labor, loss, and the warmth of an ordinary meal. That was the real turning point. Not a battle or a treaty, but the moment when enemy became guest and guest became friend. The guns had gone silent, but the lessons of decency still echoed across the plains. By harvest's end, America had proven something few nations ever could: that even in victory, compassion could be stronger than conquest. As summer deepened, the prisoner work camps began to thin. One by one, names were checked off manifests. Trains were scheduled for the long journey to ports where Liberty ships waited to carry them home. Yet something unexpected happened. Many POWs, especially those who had lived and worked on American farms, didn't want to leave. Some wrote formal petitions asking to remain in the United States as laborers. Others quietly begged the farmers who had hosted them to write letters of support. The war might have ended, but the community they'd built in the heartland had become, in their eyes, a better world than the one awaiting them in ruins. Military authorities were astonished by the loyalty these men had developed toward their captors. An officer in charge of the Midwest region wrote, "The most frequent disciplinary problem we now face is that some of them refuse to stop working." Farmers, too, felt the loss coming. In Nebraska, a local newspaper reported that one grower baked loaves of bread and fried pounds of bacon for the departing Germans, sending them off with packed lunches for the train. When he shook their hands goodbye, he simply said, "You did good work. You're welcome here any time." The climax of this quiet story wasn't marked by flags or victory parades. It unfolded instead in the barns and kitchens of ordinary Americans who discovered that decency could be more persuasive than ideology. When the first snow of autumn dusted the fields, those same families stood by fences waving as convoys of trucks rumbled down the dirt roads. Inside the vehicles, the prisoners waved back, some in tears, others holding small gifts, handkerchiefs embroidered by farm wives, photographs, even jars of home-cured coffee beans to take back across the ocean. Historians later describe this phase as the reverse occupation, a moment when defeated soldiers found themselves conquered, not by weapons, but by kindness. In the testimonies collected by the U.S. Army in 1946, many former POWs wrote that they had found America through its farmers. One described the experience as the slow dismantling of hate. Another said that the taste of bacon and the smell of coffee each morning reminded him that life can be simple again, even after war. Even German officers who at first had been skeptical of American leniency were moved. In one report, a captured lieutenant colonel admitted, "They wanted to win our respect, and they did." He went on to note that his men had learned discipline without cruelty and freedom with responsibility. These lessons would later resurface in post-war Germany, as many of those same men helped rebuild towns under the Marshall Plan. The seed of that reconstruction had been planted unknowingly in American soil, in the habits of fairness and civility learned while working beside farmers who shared breakfast instead of blame. The human side of this transformation was equally profound. After repatriation, letters continued to cross the Atlantic, carefully censored but unmistakably warm. I remember the mornings, one former POW wrote to a Kansas family, when we sat outside the barn, steam rising from our cups. "You said nothing political, only asked if the work was done right. In that silence, I learned more about America than from any lecture." Another wrote, "When I saw your son home from the war, I thought, maybe he was meant to live so we could learn how to live too." By the time the last POW ship left New York Harbor in 1946, the narrative had come full circle. Men who had once seen the United States as an abstract enemy now saw it as a living ideal, a place defined by open doors, open fields, and open hearts. The soldiers who had come to work the land left behind more than harvests. They left stories that would ripple quietly through both nations for generations. In one of the final recorded moments from Camp Angola, Iowa, as the prisoners prepared to board trains, a group of them sang "Home on the Range" in halting English. The American guards, moved beyond words, joined in. The melody carried through the cold morning air, a hymn not of war but of understanding. Bacon grease still sizzled on the stoves inside the mess hall. Coffee steamed in tin mugs. And for a brief, unforgettable moment, the boundaries between victor and vanquished ceased to exist. By early 1946, the last trains carrying German prisoners began rolling eastward through the Great Plains. The war was over, but what remained in its wake was not the bitterness of victory. It was a trail of quiet friendships scattered across American farmland. Barns that had once echoed with the sound of foreign accents now stood empty. Yet the traces of those seasons lingered. Initials carved into tool handles, a harmonica left behind, coffee tins repurposed as flower pots. Families found themselves looking at their breakfast tables differently. Where once there had been a simple meal, now there was memory of strangers who had become something more. For the German POWs, the return home was jarring. They left behind fields of abundance and stepped off trains into cities of rubble. Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden were shells of what they remembered. In post-war interrogation reports, many of them confessed that the contrast felt unbearable. "I thought Germany was strong," one former Luftwaffe mechanic told Allied debriefing. "But I saw strength in America that came from peace, not war." Some of these men would become farmers again, imitating the efficient, community-driven methods they had learned in Kansas and Iowa. Others became engineers, teachers, or local officials who quietly carried the democratic habits they had absorbed, respect, fairness, cooperation, into the new West Germany. American authorities noticed the ripple effect almost immediately. In 1948, the U.S. Office of Military Government for Germany released a report crediting former POWs with helping ease the country's transition to democratic governance. Many spoke English, admired American work culture, and resisted Soviet influence. In a sense, the breakfast table had become a classroom, and bacon and coffee had been the curriculum. No propaganda film could have achieved the same transformation that a few months of honest labor and human decency had accomplished. Back in the United States, the legacy of the POW farms was also felt in subtle ways. Newspapers ran nostalgic features about our German boys, and some communities petitioned Congress to allow a small number to immigrate permanently. A few did return legally years later under agricultural work programs, settling quietly in the Midwest. They married, raised children, and became citizens of the country that had once held them captive. The fences that had once separated them from their hosts were now gone, both literally and symbolically. For many Americans, the episode became a moral touchstone in the early Cold War years. It reminded them that kindness had strategic value, that generosity could do what armies could not. The farmer who shared his breakfast had not only fed a hungry man, he had built an ambassador of goodwill. As global tensions shifted from Berlin to Korea, policymakers often cited the POW experience as evidence that democracy spreads through example. It was, in its own quiet way, a victory that outlasted the battlefields. In personal correspondence preserved in archives, farmers and former prisoners continued writing to one another for decades. Some exchanges lasted into the 1970s, with letters filled not with politics, but with the mundane details of life. Harvest yields, family milestones, weather forecasts. Yet beneath those lines lay something profound, a shared understanding that decency had transcended ideology. One Illinois farmer wrote in 1952, "We started as enemies, but we ended as proof that men are bigger than governments." The German POW story thus closed not with a grand declaration, but with countless small echoes, the sound of a train whistle fading across the plains, the clink of coffee cups against enamel mugs, the smell of bacon on a cold morning. These were the real monuments of that chapter, ephemeral, human, unrecorded in marble, but etched deeply in memory. They represented the final measure of American strength, the ability to conquer without hatred and to teach through kindness. The last of the German prisoners returned home in the spring of 1946. The ships carrying them across the Atlantic were slow and silent, cutting through waters that had once been battle zones. As the coastlines of America receded behind them, Many stood on deck clutching gifts: a Bible, a wool jacket, a photograph of the farm family they had worked for. Some wrote farewell letters mid-voyage, sealing them in envelopes that smelled faintly of tobacco and coffee. For most, it would be months before they saw their families again. But in their hearts, they carried a strange comfort. They had glimpsed the other side of their enemy and found humanity there. In Germany, their stories began to spread. At first, few believed them. Villages still starved. Children searched ruins for coal, and defeat lingered like smoke. When these men spoke of warm barns, decent meals, and friendly Americans, listeners thought it was fantasy or propaganda. But as more prisoners returned, nearly 400,000 in total from the United States, the accounts converged. They described eggs sizzling on griddles, church choirs welcoming them, farmers treating them as equals. It sounded impossible in a world still defined by revenge, yet it was all true. Sociologists later observed that these returning POWs became bridges between two civilizations. They had seen a democracy that functioned through mutual trust rather than fear, and they carried that example into the rebuilding of West Germany. Many joined new civic organizations, local councils, and agricultural cooperatives modeled on what they had witnessed in America. In rural areas, new barns and schools were built using the same designs they had learned on U.S. farms. Simple, efficient, durable. The echoes of the Midwest spread across Bavaria and Saxony in wood and stone. For the United States, the moral and diplomatic dividends were immense. When the Marshall Plan began in 1948, American officials found unexpected allies among these former prisoners. They vouched for American intentions, helped smooth cooperation, and resisted Soviet influence in their communities. In declassified memos, U.S. policymakers called this the silent return on humanity. No treaty had been signed, no pact enforced, only goodwill, forged over shared labor and morning coffee. Even decades later, the legacy endured. In the 1980s, local newspapers in Iowa and Wisconsin reported reunions between former POWs and the farmers who had hosted them. Gray-haired men embraced like brothers, laughing through tears. One of them, a retired Wehrmacht soldier named Karl Riedel, said, "They gave us coffee when they could have given us nothing. That was the moment the war ended for me." Another, who returned to Texas as an immigrant in 1955, opened a small cafe he named Freiheit, freedom. On its signboard, he painted a steaming cup with the words, "Peace begins with breakfast." The story also left its mark on American memory. Museums and historical societies began to document these encounters, collecting letters, diaries, and photographs. The tone of those records was not triumphant but tender, a reminder that history is often written not in battles but in breakfasts. Teachers began using the POW program as an example of soft power before the term existed, showing how a nation could win hearts without coercion. By the time the Cold War reached its height, many of those who had once been enemies were quietly corresponding across oceans. Christmas cards crossed between Iowa and Bavaria, Kansas and Hesse. Some even visited each other's families, standing again in the same fields where they had once toiled under guard. The fences were gone, but the friendship remained. In every sense, the aftermath of this story was not destruction, but repair. The United States had proven that compassion could outlast conflict, that victory did not have to taste like vengeance. In the end, a few slices of bacon and a pot of coffee had done more for peace than thousands of guns ever could. History often remembers the wars themselves, the battles, the weapons, the flags raised in triumph. Yet what endured most from that vast conflict were not always the victories written in smoke and steel, but the quiet gestures that rewrote the meaning of humanity in wartime. The story of German POWs sharing bacon and coffee with American farmers was one such moment. It carried no medals, no speeches, no headlines, but it revealed a truth that outlived every tank and bomber, that even in an age of destruction, decency could still be a form of power. What began as a necessity, feeding and housing prisoners, became a living experiment in moral strength. The Americans who offered their tables did not act from strategy. They acted from instinct, guided by faith, by habit, by a belief that a man deserved breakfast before judgment. And the Germans who accepted that kindness carried home more than calories. They carried proof that democracy was not just a system, it was a behavior. It could be tasted in a meal, felt in the handshake of a farmer, heard in the clink of two tin mugs against a winter morning's silence. In time, those breakfasts became more than memories. They became quiet foundations of reconciliation, reminders that peace is not declared, it is practices. Each mug of coffee shared between former enemies was a small ceasefire, a human correction to the machinery of war. The men who once marched under banners of hate left American soil with a different inheritance, a vision of strength through compassion. Decades later, when visitors walk through the archives or read the letters between farmers and prisoners, they discover something rare. A war story that ends not in sorrow, but in understanding. The sound of sizzling bacon and the warmth of morning coffee became symbols of something unspoken, yet unforgettable. That the greatest victory is not to destroy one's enemy, but to feed him, and in doing so feed the better part of one's own soul. And so in the long ledger of the Second World War, amid all its battles and ruins, this story remains, small, human, eternal, a quiet testament to how peace first begins at the breakfast table.